Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
When we think about the long-term implications of COVID-19, we have to start to think beyond that of the respiratory system and recognize that now that we know more about the coronavirus and the long-lasting impact in terms of symptoms, we have to really focus on what is happening within the central nervous system. And I want to focus on that today because there is more and more studies and more research that's coming out that has really indicated that the coronavirus itself is very much so highly affecting our brain. And so I want to talk about that and talk about some of the things that you can be doing if you yourself are dealing with this, or if you have a friend or a family member or a coworker who is dealing with this. So I want to get into some of the science and some of the research that has come out in the last couple of months talking about the COVID long haulers, for example, which most of us have probably heard of by now, and talk about some of the mental health aspects as well as the long lingering effects. So I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and I want to talk about the COVID long haulers because I think that this is a really important thing to not overlook because there are more and more people who have been infected with COVID-19 who are having and experiencing every single day these long-lasting and really negative side effects, one would say, or symptoms from COVID. And we want to understand a little bit more about that, why that's actually occurring. And like I said, going beyond the respiratory system. Obviously, we know that some people who have had COVID can have chronic respiratory issues such as, ongoing cough or, shortness of breath, things along that line. But UC Davis, University of California, Davis, they've been looking at the COVID long haulers and understanding that there is so many of the different symptoms that people are complaining about well after they have recovered from the initial infection. And so many of these are directly correlated when we think about the central nervous system. So when we think about headaches, difficulty sleeping, the fatigue factor, as well as brain fog. Now, brain fog is one of the biggest complaints that people have been reporting back, and having issues with memory, just being incredibly forgetful, having a difficult time just focusing and concentrating on basic things that never challenged them before. And they're even finding that some people are losing focus or having a difficult time concentrating even when they're watching TV, they're sitting there trying to watch a comedy and they can't even pay attention to that. So we have to understand that when we're dealing with a viral infection, that viruses don't just poof go away. And you think about, trying to kill a virus, we can't actually kill viruses. What we can do is stop the replication process of that virus. And so that's what the targeted treatments is to try and stop the replication, the viral replication. But when we think about the residual effects, this is something that we must think about. And we have to see that, some of this may end up being permanent damage. So we certainly don't want that to become an issue when it comes to our brain. And we also are starting to see that many people, initially when the pandemic first came out, they said, if you lose your sense of smell or, the ability to taste, this could be kind of the initial clue that, yes, you have probably COVID-19. But now they're starting to realize that there are many people who are having kind of like permanent damage done from COVID-19 infections. And the long-term loss of smell and taste is something that is becoming more and more prominent. And they're even finding that some patients who initially didn't have any issues with smell or taste months later are starting to develop these types of symptoms. So I think that this is an area that we just should not completely dismiss or overlook. So let's talk a little bit about some of the science that has come out that has looked at, the long-lasting or lingering effects. The University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, they were looking at the data showing COVID-19 impact on the brain. And this was funded through the Alzheimer's Association, and they published this in the Alzheimer's and Dementia Journal. They wanted to look and see if there was any type of scientific evidence to make a case that the novel coronavirus was actually creating these long-term effects on the brain and the central nervous system. And I think that this is a very relevant study that they were looking at, and understanding that respiratory viruses are not just limited to impacting the respiratory system itself. And that's exactly what they were doing in this study, is looking beyond that of the lungs and saying, hey, wait, we're starting to see that there is this effect, this really negative effect on the brain long term. And through this actual research, I think that they have been able to determine that they need to do some really intensive studies to try to basically stop this from occurring, and to try and limit that long hauler effect, the issues with the brain fog, the issues with the memory. Because for some people it may be limited and it may resolve over the course of, a couple of weeks or a couple of months. But what we are starting to see now that we are a year into this pandemic is, for many people, they are starting to exhibit significant brain changes that are impacting their lives in an incredibly profound way. And so through this particular study, this is, what they were looking at. They were looking at the loss of smell. They were looking at the inability to taste. They were looking at chronic headaches. They were looking at the way that the brain imaging itself was looking at. And, are there certain areas within the brain where they can detect lesions that are perhaps driven because of the COVID-19 infection? And for me, I think that this is just really some remarkable research, and we understand more and more about this every day, even though we're still in the beginning of these studies. And they have now realized that 86% of mild COVID cases, patients were reporting loss of smell. So I think that this is a really key thing to walk away with, to say, okay, so the loss of smell, which we know is going to be coming from more of our central nervous system as opposed to our respiratory system. And we have 86% of mild COVID-19 cases had reported that loss of smell. So in this study, which was reported in the Journal of Internal Medicine, they were looking at the different symptoms and the prevalence and the recovery rate. And they assessed over 2,500 patients from 18 different European hospitals. And what they were finding was that the reporting symptoms of what they called olfactory dysfunction, but basically the loss of smell, was 86% of patients. And I think that that's really kind of an interesting fact, because when they looked at very severe critical cases, they were actually only seeing about 7% of those folks that said, yeah, I've lost the sense of smell. So in the mild cases, the loss of smell is much, much greater than someone who ends up with the significant respiratory effect of COVID-19. So why does this so much matter? Because we're looking at the central nervous system. We're looking at the long-term impact that this virus is playing. So say even if someone had a mild case of COVID and maybe you didn't even have that many respiratory issues, but then 4 months down the road, you're still having an issue when it comes to the loss of smell, the loss of taste. Maybe you're experiencing headaches. Maybe you have brain fog. And I've talked to many people who had COVID in the beginning of this pandemic who months later are still dealing with these issues. And it's really quite interesting to think that the brain itself is highly impacted by this virus. Now we can look at the mental health aspect of it. Clearly, there are multiple studies coming out showing different risk factors that have been linked to COVID-19 and mental health. I mean, they did a study out at North Carolina State University looking at the impact on mental health of college students and seeing, the difference between how they were dealing with different mental health challenges in the setting of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're not even talking about these students having been infected with COVID-19. We're just looking at, what type of a mental impact is this having because of the disruption in their studies, the disruption in their normal social life. I mean, they're college students. They want to be doing what normal college students do. So there are numerous studies that look at that. But what I kind of want to focus in on is how the brain is so much a player in this. And, I kind of go back to UC Davis and what they are looking at. Why are some people experiencing these long-term symptoms? And why does it seem that so many of those long-term symptoms are not related to the respiratory system, but rather to the central nervous system? So what can we be doing? This is kind of the big question. Well, first and foremost, we want to make sure that we have ample antioxidants on board every single day to fend off oxidative stress. We want to make sure that we have things like tocotrienols, which is a form of vitamin E, that we have adequate vitamin C on board, that we are taking a good amount, like 2,000 milligrams per day of omega-3 fatty acids. So whether that's coming from fish oil or krill oil or flax, we want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to allow proper nourishing within the brain. But then we also want to think about brain connectivity and thinking about things like inositol and how that is very, very beneficial for cell-to-cell communication within our brain. So we can look at different nutrients that if we have been exposed to COVID-19, or maybe you're experiencing some of these COVID long haul symptoms, that you should definitely have as part of your arsenal. So we can even look at like the Mind Synergy formulation and understanding how beneficial these powerful nutrients within a product such as Mind Synergy can be to really allow for proper neuronal connection. And I talked about the inositol briefly, which is kind of like when we think about like a B vitamin complex, is kind of how we can look at inositol. It does so much to really enhance our cognitive ability. Which is why when we look at different products that can be beneficial, we want to think about Mind Synergy as one component to that, because it's got the phosphatidylcholine. That's a very important fatty acid. It has your alpha-glycerol-phosphorylcholine in that. And we know from the science how important those fats are. So we can kind of bundle that up along with looking at the antioxidants, looking at the omega-3 fatty acids, just how impactful that can actually be. And when we look at a product like Cerebral Care, for example, the Cerebral Care is going to contain our inositol. And so a scoop of Mind Synergy, a scoop of the Cerebral Care can really set the brain up for kind of pushing through some of those struggles that is perhaps brought on due to COVID-19 impacting our central nervous system. So having enough carnitine for that cellular energy, having enough of the fatty acids that the brain needs in order to protect the cellular membrane of those very important and critical neurons. So I look at these COVID long haulers and I think to myself, are they taking in proper nutrients to try to offset or combat some of the damage that has been brought on due to the lingering effects of this virus? And that's when I turn to things such as the Cerebral Care and that Mind Synergy and say, wow, even a scoop a day of both of those along with your fish oil, along with your vitamin C and the tocotrienols, how much brain boosting power that may actually yield for someone who is dealing with the long-term impacts. And I think that this is something that should not be overlooked or just kind of accepted like, oh, okay, yeah, so you have brain fog. No, nobody wants to have brain fog by any means. Georgia State University, they have been looking at how COVID-19 attacks the brain, and it does more so attacking of the brain than it does even the lungs. And so this is an area that the research is going to continue to expand, but it is something that most of us have talked to someone who has either personally been impacted by COVID-19 or, they have a friend, family member, coworker, someone at this point in time in your life that has had exposure to COVID-19. And they may be dealing with some of these long-lasting symptoms. So that's why I wanted to talk about this today, just in a general sense, that we can't look at this virus as solely being a respiratory problem. We have to recognize, now that we are a year into this, that the brain issues that are going on with COVID-19 is really, really significant. And, you can just imagine having, COVID in the beginning of this pandemic and say 6-8 months later, you're still dealing with a loss of taste or loss of smell, or maybe, like I said, you're having chronic headaches, you can't pay attention. These are problems that people do not want to be dealing with. And so anything that we can do to support our brain and optimize the true functionality of not only the signaling pathways, but the actual structure of the brain itself is incredibly advantageous. So I will do another podcast where I kind of highlight more and more of these studies that will continue to come out, because for me, I find it incredibly interesting. I've always been kind of a fan of neurology and understanding the way that the brain works and how different things can impact our brain. And for this particular time that we are all dealing with, to now recognize that so many of these symptoms are incredibly life-changing. And, are we doing enough? Because I'm sure that, most doctors, their concern right now is not that you have brain fog. Their concern is, how do we stop the spread of this virus? And, if you do get the virus, are the symptoms, going to be mild or severe? And if they're severe, how do we treat that? So the focus is not really on what are the remedies to do if so facto you have had COVID and now you're dealing with these long hauler symptoms. So I wanted to bring this to your attention so you at least kind of have a toolkit to work with. And I will continue to talk about this topic because it's not something that's going to go away. If anything, we are going to see more and more of the long-term impact on the neurological system when it comes to COVID-19. So I know that's kind of a lot to digest, and there is so much that we still do not know. But there are certainly a lot of correlations between the central nervous system and the lingering impact of COVID-19 infections. So I will stay on top of this. Anytime that there is new news on this, I will bring it to you as soon as I can. And I just want to thank you so much for tuning in to the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health. And we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.